coming to our first Theorizing at Rowan event for the semester. I am particularly glad that we finally managed to have it. I think we've postponed this twice now, haven't we? Once, well, yeah, at least once it was my fault. But yeah, this is, we've been trying to get this event off the ground for a while. We're sort of very excited to finally actually bring it off. And so I'm gonna quickly introduce the series and the speaker, and then we're gonna kind of go into the event, and we'll have a little Q&A afterwards. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Gabriel, who is a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Politics at Princeton University, working on comparative political theory, ethics in war, race, and the uses of history in political theory. Drawing on the work of African intellectuals and diplomats, his book project focuses on the sovereignty and human dignity after the nation state. He's published on civilian immunity and just war theory, international humanitarian law, and international theory, and is currently revising article manuscripts, one critiquing the new realism and critical postcolonial theory, using the history of segregated swimming in America to challenge theoretical distinctions between political and social realms, and 3, using speech act theory to analyze canon formation. So that's a pretty wide range of stuff. That's amazing. Mayor's earned his PhD in political science from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Now, I'd like to also thank, before I introduce the title of this talk, this event is co-sponsored by the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, the Africana Studies Program, the Political Science Department, and by our department. And the talk that Dr. Maris is going to present today is called The Postcolonial State in Postcolonial Theory. So I would like to ask everyone to join me in welcoming Dr. Gabriel Maris.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Ed, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Rowan University, for hosting me this evening. So my talk may be a little bit my talk title may be a little bit misleading for a series centered in the humanities. I'm going to be talking primarily about the ways in which postcolonial theory has been taken up in political theory and within political science, but there is a strong influence of the humanities there, so I hope that we can still have a very good conversation. So starting out, what is postcolonial theory anyways? This may be less relevant for humanities scholars. So postcolonial theory emerged from a post-structuralist moment in comparative literature and emerged out of dissatisfaction with both anti-colonial thought and the failure of the academy to take up the question of empire. That really happens in the 70s and 80s, and one of the reasons why I start with that is that political theory came very late to the question of empire. While other parts of empirical political science were interested in empire, decolonization, and others, political theory was still very canon-centric at the same time that postcolonial theory was radically restructuring comparative literature, anthropology, history, and related disciplines. So part of what I'm identifying as a problem in political theory is the way in which postcolonial theory winds up getting taken up in this sort of late moment. Really not until the 1990s, and really doesn't start having an enormous effect on the field until the 2000s. So interest in political theory began as a rethinking of canonical theorists, sort of asking questions about, well, what did Kant say about empire? What did Hegel say about empire? What did Edmund Burke? Was Edmund Burke actually an anti-imperial thinker? Was John Stuart Mill? These sorts of questions. And not really decentering Europe at the same time that political theory is trying to take up these postcolonial influences. That changes dramatically starting right around 2010 with two related moves. The first is the rise of indigenous political theory, but the second is there's a movement towards the retrieval of anti-colonial revolutionary thought, but guided through sort of post-colonial themes. We're well past the sort of moment of anti-colonial revolution. It's impossible to escape the influence of post-colonial theory. So people are essentially, the term they use is recovering overlooked or forgotten political theories from anti-colonial revolutionaries. And they're using post-colonial concept critique to argue for the relevance of these political theories. So I have, in the first part of this talk, I'm going to be addressing Adam Getachu's excellent book, World Making After Empire. It is the strongest contribution to this wave of scholarship. It's also, I think, emblematic of some of the ways in which political theory has a problematic relationship with these post-colonial theorists, or with these anti-colonial theorists and the sort of post-colonial milieu. So a big character in her book is Kwame Nkrumah, whom we have here. I do want to emphasize post-colonial or political theorists are not wrong to return to anti-colonial revolutionaries. But when, in this particular moment, when we return to that anti-colonial moment, to the moment of decolonization, the questions that drive research and what kind of framework gets used bring essentially three concepts to the fore, which winds up creating a problematic account of anti-colonial thinking, and I argue puts it in tension with aspects of post-colonial theory. So the three ideas are the state, the idea of structure, and the idea of power. What happens, I argue in my paper, is that post-colonial theory emerging in the 70s and 80s came out of, in many ways, a critique of unitary thinking in anti-colonial thought. Hence the post-structuralist moment. Post-colonial political theory, though, however, has sort of erased that aspect of critique. And in its search to engage with really existing inequality in the world, which political theory should do, which it absolutely should do, it has adopted particular conceptions of domination and how domination works through structure, through sovereign equality or inequality, and through power that revive a problematic account of the post-colonial state. And this is what I term tragic structuralism. So structural power is structural when structures or systems, whether due to they were designed this way or just historical contingency, consistently achieve certain ends without individual agents necessarily or consciously attempting to achieve those ends. So if we say we have a neo-imperial structure, that doesn't mean that states of the third world or global south or Africa or Latin America or whichever terminology you used in your discipline, in your particular discipline, a neo-imperial structure would mean that it wouldn't be necessary for, say, the President of the United States or the UN Secretary General to be committed to the continued domination of these states. The structure just ensures that it happens. I refer to it as tragic, and I have David Scott's Conscripts of Modernity. I am borrowing his use of tragedy. Tragic, not in the sense of it's sad, it's too bad that something like this has happened, but in a more classical sense of the ultimate inescapability. So jumping back, if international structures are neo-imperial, if power is totalizing, then the political aims of post-colonial actors, of global South actors, must be to try and find outside points from which to resist or overthrow these totalizing structures. These are then narrated as tragic or as tragedies because ultimately the power is inescapable. What does this mean for theorizing the post-colonial state, or for theorizing post-colonial international structures that exist and systems and institutions that exist in a post-colonial world, in a world after decolonization? Well, what that means for theorists such as Getachew and many others as well is that attempts at innovation in state form, in institutions, are constantly undercut by malevolent outside actors. So, writing about the new international economic order in World Making After Empire, Getachew writes that internal limitations and inconsistencies do not in and of themselves explain the collapse of the NIEO, as external challenges ensured that the project never had the opportunity for its contradictions to unfold. So, the idea being that there could have been problems with the NIEO, but it's really not fruitful, or could have been internal problems, I should say, but it's really not fruitful to make that your research agenda because the NIEO was a death foretold, that global structures were not going to allow an alternative space for decolonized states to try and establish the terms of economic non-domination. But what happens in these structural accounts is we wind up losing, I argue, a strong account of global South agency. So in Getachew's work, what we see is a consistent juxtaposing of what anti-colonial statesmen believed against what malevolent outside actors did. So this is particularly the case when she's discussing Kwame Nkrumah's the turn of his fortunes in Ghana. I'm sorry. We get an analysis of Nkrumah's ideals, and then Nkrumah and Ghana are acted upon by outside actors. So Nkrumah's sort of proto-dependency theory, I should stop for a second and state, is a theory of political economy that former colonial powers established structures and relationships of economic dependence and political dependence between former colonies and former colonizers. So while former colonies are now technically independent, in fact, actually their economic and political fortunes are tied to the whims and desires of the former colonizing power. So Nkrumah's sort of proto-dependency theory is his account is offered as an alternative structure in which the terms of non-domination might be achieved, but there's no evaluation of the feasibility and of these ideas, and more importantly, there's very little discussion of what Nkrumah as a political agent did. We understand that that global economic actors looked to punish Ghana, but we don't really have a sense of what did Ghanan politicians, statesmen, and just agents do. And one of the problems then with tragic structuralism is that it consistently pushes towards this exposition of ideals, which are then tragically undercut by outsiders. What I want to do for the remainder of the talk, for actually the bulk of the talk, is talk about two alternative approaches. On the left is the Ugandan South Asian anthropologist, sometimes feels like the wrong term, Mahmoud Mamdani, and that's the right, stage left and stage right. On the right is Mahmoud Mamdani. On the left is the South Sudanese legal anthropologist and diplomat Francis Deng. Now, Mamdani is very well known in the humanities as well as social sciences. Deng, much less so. For those who are familiar with both of them, talking about them together might seem a little incoherent at best. Incoherent at worst, counterintuitive at best. I'm hoping for counterintuitive. So most famously, perhaps, Francis Deng is the intellectual father of a concept that's known as sovereignty as responsibility, which is the doctrine of sovereignty on which the United Nations the UN doctrine of the responsibility to protect is based. Mahmoud Mamdani is one of the biggest critics of the UN doctrine of the responsibility to protect. However, I would say that just thinking of them as writing in opposition to each other overlooks the ways in which actually their arguments are intertwined and the ways in which they both very fruitfully use the post-colonial tradition of concept critique for thinking about the agency of global South actors. I will begin with Mamdani. Mamdani, one of the reasons why I said it seems strange to call him an anthropologist, Mamdani did not train as an anthropologist. He earned a PhD in Harvard's government department. That sounds elite and fancy, but he was in fact not in residence. He was working at the University of Dar es Salaam while he was writing his dissertation. And this was a period of time when in the early 1970s, there were a lot of sort of what were at the time termed radical third worldist ideas, especially around the idea of political economy. And Mamdani trained as a political economist. So he wrote a dissertation entitled Politics and Class Formation in Uganda, which then became his first book. And it was a fairly standard Marxist class analysis applied to sub-Saharan African state. Mamdani, in this period, wound up actually becoming stateless 3 times. First, as a graduate student, he had been born with Ugandan and British citizenship, but since he did not renounce British citizenship at the age of 21, Uganda said that he had lost his Ugandan citizenship. The UK said that because he hadn't claimed his UK citizenship at 21, that he had lost UK citizenship. And the best part of this was he was living in the United States at the time, and he had no American citizenship, so he was stateless. And his options were he could enlist in the military. This was during the war in Vietnam, so that would probably not have been a good choice. That could have earned him legal residency status. That's the term I'm looking for. That could have earned him legal residency status. Instead, he applied to graduate study at Harvard, and Harvard sponsored somebody for study who had no citizenship at that point in time. Eventually, he was able to get traveling documents from the UK on the terms that he not use it to travel to the UK. And he returned to Uganda in 1972, months before Idi Amin expelled South Asians from Uganda. So that would then become his second experience of statelessness. When the Amin government was overthrown, he was welcomed back. And in 1984, giving a speech to the Red Cross about famine in Uganda at the time, he said that it was not a weather-related incident, but was in fact the result of governmental policy. He received a letter from an interior minister from Uganda saying that his citizenship was now revoked. So Mamdani experienced statelessness 3 times over the course of just over a decade from this. And it comes out of a lot of this struggle around the post-colonial state, especially starting with that first moment of the UK and Uganda both washing their hands of what had been a citizen of both countries. So why is all this important? So Mamdani starts out as a sort of standard third world political economist. He writes a book in 1986 based on lectures he gave to striking railway workers in Dar es Salaam, entitled Imperialism and Fascism in Uganda. And it's an analysis of the Amin regime, and it is it's standard third world political economy mixed with neo-imperial structural analysis. So he writes that the long-term interests of imperialism in Uganda could only be protected by a socioeconomic and political system that would tie Uganda up in the web of imperialist interest. All political power is directed to specific economic ends, and there is no such thing as power as an end in itself. And the whole book is like that. In fact, actually, Mamdani disowns the book at this point. He recommends people not read it. And he draws heavily on Walter Rodney, another very important anti-colonial thinker, for theorizing how this neo-imperial domination works in practice. But a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. So anthropology, as some of you may know, was the imperial discipline. In the British Empire, especially, anthropology became the imperial mode of knowledge production. It was central to how the British were going to rule their empire in the 20th century. And in the 1990s, anthropology goes through this moment of trying to cast off that history and reinvent itself. So Mamdani is invited to join the anthropology department at Columbia University. He expresses surprise. He says, "I've never read an anthropology textbook." And the chair of the department says, "Well, we've read what you've written, and we think it's anthropology." So that's the story of why it's strange to call him an anthropologist. And at this point, Mamdani has been reading post-colonial theory, but most importantly, there's been the outbreak of quote-unquote ethnic conflict in the wake of the Cold War. So in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide, Mamdani is invited to Rwanda to act as an observer, and he winds up interviewing a number of his former students who were RPF commandos, and he writes a book on the Rwandan genocide entitled When Victims Become Killers. And one of the most important things, I think, is from very early on in that book, and it marks a decisive break where Mamdani pushes away the tradition of third world political economy and pushes away the idea of the neo-imperial structure as controlling. So he writes, the limits of political economy as a framework for political analysis became clear in the face of post-colonial political violence. For political economy could only explain violence when it resulted from a clash between market-based identities, either class or division of labor. From this point of view, political violence had to be either revolutionary or counter-revolutionary. In the face of political violence that cut across social classes rather than between them, and that was animated by distinctions crafted in colonial law rather than those sprouting from the soil of a commodity economy, explanations rooted in political economy turned arid. So the sort of analysis that he did of Uganda, of the Amin regime, couldn't give any purchase on the Rwandan genocide for him. He'd also, just a few years earlier, written another book on the legacy of late imperialism on ethnic conflict. It's entitled Citizen and Subject. Importantly, and this is explored in both Citizen and Subject and When Victims Become Killers, race and ethnicity were colonial projects. These projects reified certain identities into obvious categories. So it's not necessarily that there was no difference between peoples prior to the arrival of European colonization. That much is clearly not true. But these identities become firm taxonomies, and importantly, or perhaps most importantly, power is distributed along these lines. And the British, with their anthropological knowledge of native societies, wind up deciding who is authentically this and who is authentically that. And it's in that reification of difference that Mamdani identifies the seeds of post-colonial, quote-unquote, ethnic conflict. These are colonial category conflicts. So what we need is not a political economy of post-colonial violence. What we need is a concept critique of colonial categories. I am actually going to speed ahead to Deng because I took longer than I had originally intended. So Deng is another curious figure who's trained as an anthropologist while not training in an anthropology department. He was Southern Sudanese and the son of a paramount chief in the Ngok Dinka in the Abyei region of Sudan. He was in the first generation to attend higher education outside of the country within his tribe. Now, when I say paramount chief, that sounds very important. Yes, the British wanted it to sound very important. So Deng's family is, in fact, actually a case study in precisely this reification of authentic power, authentic culture, and centralization of power in those identities. So Deng's family line had been authorized by British colonists to be the representatives and enforcers of authentic Dinka culture within their tribe. Now, so he's, on the one hand, he's a third world elite going abroad to study in the UK. This sounds like a very familiar story about global, or about rootless elites who are unconnected to the global south countries that they come from, and they hobnob with important people, and they go on to fantastically important jobs. Deng was special rapporteur for internally displaced persons and special advisor to the UN Secretary General on the responsibility to protect. So doing a quick look at his bio, one might conclude Deng embodies that perfectly. But I argue that actually, if we read Deng's legal anthropology of Sudan, especially focusing on his period, his time studying Sudan between the civil wars, so between 72 and 83, what we see is, in fact, actually case study after case study that really is in sync with Mamdani's arguments about the ways in which identity is a colonial project and the struggle, the post-colonial struggle, is undoing those legacy identities. And Sudan is, in many ways, a story of failing to undo those identities. So Deng and Mamdani both write against the sort of Western conceptions of the major conflicts in Sudan in the 21st century for Americans and the UK. So first, the conflict in Darfur, and second, sort of coming to recognize the civil war, but misrecognizing it as a civil war between South and North, and more importantly, recognizing it as a civil war between bad Arab Muslim state, oppressive state, and good black non-Muslim tribes. And for Deng and for Mamdani, this both recreates the colonial conceptions. This is fueled also, by the way, by the War on Terror. These recognitions in the 21st century are definitely shaped by the War on Terror. But they wind up recreating and reifying the colonial identity categories. They incentivize people in Sudan to then claim those identities. And in fact, actually, the result of Western mediation in Sudan is accelerated ethnic cleansing. So South Sudan gets independence in 2011. In 2014, there's the Juba massacre, in which 10,000 people are killed in 3 days. Cleaving off what seems like an obvious identity to people in the West, in fact, actually just incentivizes making these identities more and more violent, because power is doled out based on claims to identity. So then these efforts at mediation, letting everybody be self-determining, incentivize making your identity group incompatible with a larger state. There's no reason to engage in reconciliation if, in fact, your identity group is supposed to have its own state. And if you can convince Western negotiators to pressure for you to have your own state. Drawing this back in, the post-colonial state in post-colonial theory, post-colonial political theory has, I think, dangerously grabbed onto early anti-colonial thinking about the state and about neo-imperial structures. In a perfectly admirable and perfectly understandable attempt to address real, visible, existing inequalities, in fact, we are repeating a lot of the same mistakes in thinking about states, state capacity, and sovereignty that Mamdani and Deng, and I would argue there, though Deng would not call himself a post-colonial theorist, and many other post-colonial theorists who have elective affinities with these two, avoid by focusing on concept critique rather than attempting to do structural analysis based on the idea of the sovereign equality of states. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for this talk. I was very interested in it, and I feel like it sort of whet my appetite, and now I want to hear more. So I do have a few questions, but one of them is, do both of these thinkers, is the problem that the structural perspective that many post-colonial political theorists adopt is always totalizing and always rejects the nation state, or rejects the idea that states are actors, or is the critique that there simply is no agency? And I ask because I'm curious, first of all, and I have my own questions about the extent to which these theories apply to our contemporary reality, and the extent to which the framework of imperialism applies. And also, I wonder about whether actually many things can be true at the same time. So, we can, I guess the question is, what is the basis for the rejection? Because you touched on that a little bit, but I guess didn't have time to go super deep into it. And also, if you think that these things are really incommensurable, concept critique of these legacy identities, and some kind of neo-imperialism that might still be at work. Can we have a little of each, or do we really, along with these theorists, need to commit to either one or the other in order to understand global self-agency?
Okay. So, Mamdani would certainly, I take him to say there are neo-imperial aspects, but he's not doing it from a political economy perspective. So he's using concept critique in some ways. He wrote a piece on the responsibility to protect, which is called Responsibility to Protect or Right to Punish. And what he argues is that R2P is, in fact, a reinvigoration of a colonial right to punish. That colonial powers could go throughout the world and punish malefactors. Those are, that's a neo-imperial thesis, I would say, but it's not a neo-imperial thesis rooted in a dependency thesis. And it's also, importantly, I don't take him to be a tragic structuralist. It's not that. So when Mamdani is, so Mamdani says, okay, these identities wind up getting invented, or not invented, I'm sorry, wind up getting reified by colonial powers. But then people run with the identities. So those people are also agents. And when he goes to Darfur, or I'm sorry, not Darfur, he went to Darfur later. When he went to Rwanda and he interviewed his former students who were RPF commandos, he treats them as, fully agentic. And there's nothing inevitable about, the reification of Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa identities and the genocide. Where I take issue with so much post-colonial political theory is there's, in this attempt at recovery, there's sort of a reaching back and plucking a theorist or a revolutionary or a statesman out of their particular context reconstructing the context in a way that's maybe a little bit more relevant to our concerns and maybe a little bit less relevant to their concerns, and saying, aha, neo-imperialism, neoliberalism, whatever, has erased this radical structural critique from our minds, and we need to recover. These people were in dialogues, and the dialogues progressed. So when we talk about Nkrumah's ideas, these ideas get taken up by various people, they get tested, they get argued over. Nobody's spouting, even in radical political economy circles, nobody's spouting Nkrumah's thesis in 1982. There's progress in the field, essentially. And so what political theory, I am worried, is doing is we're plucking particular moments from these political economy debates and divorcing them from the broader dialogues that they're in. And then, as a result of that, we're not learning from ways in which these people might have been wrong. And we then, I'm speaking broadly, we political theorists, and so rather than thinking about the ways in which these people might have been wrong, these institutions may have had shortcomings, the fill-in is that, well, this failed because the structure came and wouldn't allow it to, here was this alternative, here was this lost moment, and the neo-imperial structure crushed it, rather than thinking about the agency of these people and their interlocutors and how did other people think of it as playing out. So,
can I follow up with them?
Yeah.
So I'm super interested in this because it also, let me get where's the I'm interested in this because it ultimately seems like it's an argument, or it's moving in the direction of being an argument for, you're not quite saying it, but you're coming really close to saying it. So maybe I'm just going to give you an opportunity to say it, right? That what political theory is doing is sort of missing the point of actually engaging with kind of post-colonial discourses, because it's using it's framing that engagement essentially as a way of reconstructing the idea that, the colonial, imperial, whatever you want to call it, structures that have been put in place are determinative, right? And so it is a way, in some sense, of doing post-colonialism, where the outcome of doing post-colonialism is, oh, look, the global political order is still driving the show. The global political order that was created by the colonial order is still driving the show.
Yeah.
It's driving the bus.
Well, so not every political theorist influenced by post-colonial theory would fall into that. But importantly, there are also, and maybe in my talk I let them off easy, there are also post-colonial theorists, not political theorists. There are also post-colonial theorists who do the same thing. So Robert J.C. Young in Postcolonialism, an Introduction, name checks Andre Gunder Frank, who's a major Latin American dependency theorist from the 60s and early 70s, as sort of giving the model of how the global system works. And Gunder Frank is very much the global determinant, the global domination through relationships of dependency established by former colonial powers, continuing to essentially pull the strings. There are Gayatri Spivak in her 2004 Amnesty International lectures, At first it seems like she is sort of trying to break apart the idea of, a unified third world identity, which is a wonderful post-colonial project. But then it sort of turns into this straightforward Marxist class analysis where the Indian elite are just part of a global elite that are dominating over the subaltern. And that, that then continues this, very determinative rather than what I take as a virtue of so much post-colonial theorists, the open-endedness that results from thinking conceptually. In the 90s, there were plenty of Marxists and critical IR theorists who critiqued post-colonial theorists for, well, you're thinking too much about language. What about real domination that we can see? And I think that the unfortunate result of some of that has been to bring back some of these explanations rooted in particular in a Marxist political economy to explain things that are supposedly easy to see.
So and then that gets you to, okay, this is why we need to pay attention both to the way in which kind of things like ethnicities are constructed by the kind of colonial system, but also how they're then taken up.
Right. Yeah.
In the aftermath of its departure and turned into, the basis for negotiating kind of local power relations.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Other people? Our student, you got anything?
No, I'm just trying to kind of piece together kind of what you were saying, how these two.
You're welcome to ask clarifying questions too, because I need practice.
You did actually an excellent job of describing how these two interact with each other and how that kind of affects kind of this global theory. I think that was really interesting.
Let me check the. I'm going to give the. I don't think our virtual audience is coming up with anything, unfortunately. Do you have another one, Eva?
It's also a follow-up, and I'm wondering if this is also what you're saying.
Okay.
I'm not super familiar with contemporary political, post-colonial political theory necessarily. But it sounds to me like what you're saying is that there is a kind of mythologizing or a hagiography of these post-colonial, of these theorists from the 70s, from a particular moment, and a particular moment in critique, and that by virtue of, engaging in that hagiography and that mythologization, there is a kind of maybe Eurocentric kind of totalizing of the realities that are not necessarily engaging with what's happening on the ground and the decades of actual political engagement that have happened on the ground. And I'm thinking of places like, like Bolivia or Colombia, where there have been, where state structures or organizations that are connected to the post-colonial state have taken up, ideas like buen vivir or indigenous concepts that are decolonial, but they're engaging in that set of contradictions that I think becomes kind of ossified when we look back and kind of pull things out of context. But that's from not being on the ground doing the stuff, which is full of complexity. And it's not the case that it's like, oh, well, it's either political economy or it's this one other thing. It's like on the ground, stuff is really messy. And it has been, continues to be. It was for Nkrumah, it was for whoever.
Yeah.
Any of these writers, for Cabral, or people who are mythologized as these decolonial figures, and it's like, oh, this is the theory we're adopting now. It was complicated for them. And so it doesn't, it's a theoretical exercise to take these thinkers up. But ultimately, it might be more productive for theory to look at that complexity and really engage in those contradictions that have been happening on the ground, even though it's not great for writing a book that has one polarizing thesis, which is like what theory likes to do. But I'm wondering if that's sort of what you're getting at.
Well, so there are some fantastic political theorists who do on-the-ground work
Sure.
in places that you've mentioned as well. I've been colleagues with some of them. But at the same time, you can even sometimes doing the on-the-ground work, you can then see traces of, these. So, when there was the Bolivian coup, what was that, 2015, 2016, somewhere in there? There were a lot of people who had they had a very specific neo-imperial story to tell. That the coup leaders were carrying out were acting in the interests of international capital in order to bring Bolivian lithium to the global market that the indigenous didn't want mined. And so this was a case of, local actors carrying out, international neo-imperial capitalist extractivist desires. Well, I'm not sure that's a really good account of the Bolivian coup. First of all, Bolivia has a history of extractivism, even among the indigenous. Peru as well. Peru has anti-wildcat mining laws that are, directly targeting indigenous peoples, not at the behest of international capital, but at the behest of environmental rights groups, because the wildcat mines use mercury to get the gold, to separate the gold out, and then the mercury just gets dumped into the river. So the environmental groups didn't want the wildcat mines. Some people see that as, well, you're not allowing independent, indigenous mining the way it has always been done. If you're coming into it with that neo-imperial frame, everything, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You may not be sensitive to the dynamics on the ground. And so you may do that on the ground work, but it may wind up just confirming the thesis you went in with. So.
Last time, I didn't see anything about that. So I'd like to ask everyone to help me thank Professor Ramirez. This was fascinating.